It's one of the most common questions that people ask me. Can pornography actually change your personality? Well, the answer is much more nuanced than most people realize. Pornography doesn't change who you are at your core, but the repeated overstimulation can in fact change the way that your brain processes reward, motivation, attention, and desire. Once those systems begin adapting, people often notice changes that extend far beyond their sexual behavior. They begin feeling less motivated, less engaged, less present, even less excited about the things that once mattered to them most. They may even look around at their own life and think, what happened to me? That question is actually pointing in the right direction because your very identity can be at risk in the way that your brain has learned to operate. Understanding that distinction is incredibly important because if your brain learned these patterns, it also has the capacity to learn new ones. This video is brought to you by my HarperCollins published book, Mind Over Explicit Matter. If you're ready to quit porn and reclaim your life mentally and physically, go over to drtrishleigh.com/book. If you watched the first video in this series, you already understand what I call the dopamine hijack. Your reward system begins responding to levels of stimulation it was never designed to experience repeatedly. What surprises almost everyone, though, is that those changes don't stay confined to sexual behavior. Over time, many people begin noticing that they can't concentrate the way that they used to. Their motivation begins slipping. Work that once felt engaging suddenly feels exhausting. Healthy relationships don't create the same sense of excitement that they once did. Hobbies that used to bring genuine enjoyment somehow feel flat or uninteresting. Eventually, they begin saying something that I hear almost every day in my practice. I just don't feel like myself anymore. So if that sounds familiar to you, I want you to know something important. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost who you are. It may simply mean that your brain has been adapting to the environment that you've repeatedly exposed it to. This is what I call the miswire stage, and understanding it changes the conversation from blame to brain science. One of the most common concerns people bring to me has nothing to do with sex at all. They tell me they've lost their ambition. They know exactly what they should be doing, but they can't seem to make themselves do it. They procrastinate more than they used to. Difficult tasks now feel incredibly overwhelming. Building their business, advancing their career, exercising consistently, investing in relationships, or pursuing meaningful goals all begin requiring far more effort than they used to. That makes perfect sense once you understand dopamine. Remember, dopamine isn't simply about pleasure. It's the neurotransmitter that helps your brain pursue effortful rewards. Effortful rewards. When your reward system repeatedly experiences highly stimulating rewards that require almost no effort, it gradually recalibrates what feels worth pursuing. Real life hasn't actually become more difficult. Your brain simply has become accustomed to receiving large bursts of reward without the effort that healthy rewards typically require. Suddenly, ordinary life begins feeling neurologically expensive. This happens even though nothing about life itself has changed. The next change happens in a place most people never think to look, and that's your attention system. Every time your brain scrolls from one image to another, one fantasy to another, one video to another, it's practicing rapid attentional switching. At first, that may not seem particularly significant, but your brain is constantly adapting to whatever it repeats most often. So then eventually sitting quietly to read a book, or working deeply on a project, or even studying for an exam, or remaining fully present during a meaningful conversation, all of these things can begin to feel surprisingly difficult. Your attention isn't broken. It's been trained to expect continuous novelty. That's one reason that so many people instinctively reach for their phone the moment there's a pause in the day. If you're standing in the line, waiting at a stoplight, sitting through a commercial, or experiencing just a few quiet moments, it can become uncomfortable because the brain has learned something more stimulating might always be waiting for you beyond the next swipe. So this isn't simply a technology problem. It's actually a neuroplasticity problem. Your brain has become exceptionally efficient at chasing novelty because that's exactly what you've been asking it to practice. But one of the brain's greatest strengths is its remarkable ability to learn through association. Neuroscientists call this conditioning. So think about what happens when your phone buzzes. Before you've even picked it up, your brain has already begun anticipating that something interesting, exciting, or rewarding might be waiting for you. That's conditioning at work. The same process happens with repeated exposure to pornography. Over time, your brain begins linking scrolling, certain categories, particular websites, specific times a day, or even simply being alone with the anticipation of the reward. Those cues gradually become part of the pathway your brain expects before producing strong arousal. This helps explain why many men begin experiencing porn-induced erectile dysfunction, or PIED. It isn't that their body has forgotten how to function, it's that their brain has slowly learned to expect a very specific sequence before activating the reward system. The brain has become conditioned to artificial cue instead of real-world connection. And because the brain is doing exactly what it has been taught to do, what you taught it to do, through those conditioned pathways, they've become increasingly automatic. So this is where I know that everything begins to come together. At first, many people live in what I call strained brain. Their mind is constantly searching, constantly switching and scanning for the next source of stimulation. In the beginning, that can actually feel exciting because the reward system is working overtime. But the brain was never designed to remain in that heightened state indefinitely. So eventually, the system begins wearing itself out. What started as strained brain gradually becomes what I call drain brain. Motivation falls, focus becomes harder to sustain, confidence begins slipping. Healthy intimacy feels less satisfying. Even everyday experiences begin losing some of the richness and the color. This is often the point where someone says to me, "I'm not exactly depressed, but I just don't feel like myself anymore." That statement tells me we're no longer talking only about pornography. In fact, we're talking about the health of the entire reward system and how it has adapted over time. Now, if everything we're discussing here feels discouraging, I want to leave you with what I believe is the most hopeful part of the entire conversation. None of these changes happened because your brain failed. They happened because your brain succeeded at learning. Neuroplasticity was working exactly the way it was designed to work. And that's wonderful news, because the same brain that learned those unhealthy patterns can absolutely learn healthier ones. This is where many people unknowingly keep themselves stuck. They believe that recovery is simply about stopping pornography. While changing the behavior is certainly an important first step, behavior is only the surface. Underneath every single habit are neural pathways that have been strengthened through repetition. If those pathways aren't retrained, the old patterns continue pulling the brain back toward those familiar behaviors, even when someone genuinely wants to change. Lasting recovery isn't just about removing the habit. It's about teaching your brain a new way of operating. So the question naturally becomes, how do you actually teach your brain a different pattern? And can the reward system recover? Can motivation come back? Can you improve your attention? Can healthy intimacy become satisfying again? Well, according to everything we know about neuroplasticity, the answer is a resounding yes. But recovery doesn't happen simply because you try harder or you rely on willpower. It happens because you intentionally teach your brain something new. So in the next video, I'm going to show you exactly how that process works, why quitting alone often isn't enough, and the neuroscience-based approach I use to help people move from miswired to becoming rewired. So I'm going to see you in the next video, and remember, control your brain or it will control you. I'll see you soon.